All right, hello everybody, and welcome to this session of the Florida Digital Humanities Consortium webinar series. My name is Tiffany Esteban. I'm the Digital Humanities Associate at the University of Florida Libraries. I'm also the Secretary of the Florida Digital Humanities Consortium and the moderator of today's webinar, which is part of this year's FLDH webinar series, Latin American and Caribbean edition. To start things off, I'd first like to thank you all for being here, especially our speakers, who I will introduce in a moment. I'd also like to thank Hélène Huet, the European Studies Librarian at the University of Florida Libraries. She is also the past chair of FLDH and the organizer of the series. Now to introduce our speakers, Dr. Sylvia Fernández and Dr. Laura Gonzales, who will be presenting United Fronteras, a Transborder digital and public repository. So first, Dr. Sylvia Fernández is a transborder activist and interdisciplinary researcher and educator. Her work lies at the intersection of border and Latinx literature, languages, cultures, and archives, anti-feminicides and gender violence movements, transnational and intersectional feminism, and public and digital technologies, infrastructures, and knowledge production. She has written about and produced public and digital humanities work to bring about social justice change through consciousness raising in the analog and digital cultural record. She is an assistant professor of public and digital humanities with the Interdisciplinary School for Engagement in the Humanities and Social Sciences at the University of Texas at San Antonio. And Dr. Laura Gonzales is a community engaged researcher and practitioner here at the University of Florida. Her work highlights the importance of language justice in community, academic, and technological contexts. She is the author of Sites of Translation, What Multilinguals Can Teach Us About Digital Writing and Rhetoric from the University of Michigan Press in 2018, and Designing Multilingual Experiences in Technical Communication from Utah State University Press in 2022. So everyone, please join me in welcoming Dr. Fernández and Dr. Gonzales.
I don't know if should I start. Thank you so much, Tiffany, for the great introductions. And I just wanted to thank Clayton and Helen, who couldn't be here, but she's organizing these webinars of Latin American and Caribbean studies. And we're very honored to be presenting United Fronteras and the work that emerged from that initiative a couple of years ago in regards to digital humanities and borderlands regions. And should I go ahead and start?
Yes, please do.
Okay, perfect. So I'm gonna share my screen because I have a couple of slides to show, and the dynamic we will be having is we will present briefly about United Fronteras and the work that emerged after that. And then we have a couple of comments and questions for a discussion, but please feel free that throughout the presentation, if there's anything you want to discuss and bring in after our brief presentations, comment on the chat and we can cover that. And a little bit of what this work it's in regards to thinking about border and borderlands, transborder communities in different parts of the world. In this case, in 2019, we started working together to think about what is the technologies, what is the production that has emerged and that it's available in communities, what we know about the US-Mexico border, what has been erased from the analog and digital record, and our ideas of what is the border into what it's being produced. And thinking about the own dynamics of the border and borderlands cultures, This is grounded in indigenous epistemologies and experiences that are grounded in movement, that are grounded in connections between both sides of these regions, that they don't see walls, but they are looking for sometimes forms of resistance or forms to keep connected and to keep communicating. But at the same time, there has been the development of many technologies that have altered these dynamics between communities, but also between the environment. And looking at the analog and digital record, that's also being presented. Moving forward, this kind of dynamics not only exists in the US-Mexico border. Latin America has many transborder communities within the nation states or across different parts of the Americas that have been completely been working within these dynamics without the support sometimes of governments. And many of these dynamics are also important to think about within digital humanities. So those are the things that we would like to discuss. In this case, we will be concentrating in the Mexico-United States border that has been a space of colonization and has been in constant dispute and surveillance, as you all know, but that there has been many efforts, many communities that have been creating their own digital projects, their own initiatives to resist or to contest some of the impositions and assimilation that have made us think about between language, between culture, between history, but at the same time, between how information is being shared in one side or the other. This kind of dynamics, we're understanding them as what Gloria Ansaldúa proposed in 1987 as a third space, thinking about third spaces also in the digital record, about how does that third space look like when there are practices and there are forms of even developing technologies and resources to resist those impositions of division or heritage between the global north and the global south. As we understand, if you just look at, if you make a search in the internet and type US-Mexico border, it is dominated and it is controlled by certain algorithms, rhetorics, and images that mainly talk about the border as an isolated place, as a divided place, but also it's a rhetoric of dehumanizations against migrants and against border communities. Everything that has been produced within the digital record, it mostly presents this rhetorics of una amenaza, like a threat between one side of the other, and about a dangerous place. So how there would be the initiatives that can create digital projects that tell other stories, not just the single story that has been dominated by the US government or the Mexican government against migrations in these spaces. Similarly, between the US-Mexico border, there has been also a lot of development and initiatives, even in universities, to work for cybersecurity, for engineering, and for data science to develop data, develop technologies to surveil and to control these spaces where it's not accepted that communities move back and forth, that they communicate between these communities, and that a lot of these technologies are pushing for division and for making communities other people rather than feeling in their same spaces. How can we think about digital humanities in the borderlands that can be intervened and create critical thinking when developing these technologies, these data sets, and these forms of sharing information between one and the other side that doesn't look only as surveillance or extraction of information for these communities. In 2019, we created United Fronteras with the intention to counteract between this official and hegemonic representation and promote the questioning and the critical development of materials or projects that use digital technologies to represent the border from a greater number of perspectives. This initiative was created with the intention to see what was out there, what were some of the challenges that people creating projects were facing, what was missing, why people were not doing projects that really represent communities from these areas. And we found a lot of situations. We found situations that the archives are divided, that many owned communities from the border don't have access to these archives, that there's different technologies between one side and the other, and that has been an acknowledgement and a push for this kind of questioning from digital humanities in the global south and in Mexico. And one of the work that pushes for that, it's the work of Isabel Galina. And thinking about that, this project was created. It was an independent and autonomous project that didn't receive any funding, neither from one side or the other, specifically because of the positionality of this project that didn't want it to keep one representation as the main thing, and that we wanted to respect the perspectives and the positionalities of other community projects that were included in this project, as well as the different dynamics of the team that I will be discussing briefly. It is the first Transborder directory of its kind that put together projects from both sides and that emerged from the historical geopolitical transitions of this work. Please feel free to scan the code and you will have access to United Fronteras. The workflow of this project, it's following a Transborder dynamic in which it was put together members from both sides. Some of them are in academia, some of them work not in academia, and have different experiences from the border. There's not just one perspective of how people understand the border. Some of them are native border citizens, some others migrated to the border, some others visited the border, and others are just studying the border. And that was something so important to put together so that it could be a broader understanding of how to follow the establishment in this project, of how to see the project, how to see the border, and what kind of projects we're going to be gathered for this. The workflow was also interdisciplinary. Different people had different skills, different knowledges, and that was also so important that we were not looking for people expert in the area of digital humanities or border studies. It was an intersection and an interdisciplinary work that was very valuable, because that made a workflow of learning from each other that sometimes in academia that's very restrictive, and that it's imposed that there's just one dominant discipline that controls some of the projects. In here, it was also a dynamic of learning from each other and learning how to work together within the different skills and knowledges in here. Since the project was independent and autonomous, we also look for minimal computing practices, methods, and tools to make this project sustainable, and to also learn, specifically working from the border, not to use technologies and platforms that can have a priority on one side or the other, and that can also be an example for other projects of how to create their work more sustainable and to contest these technologies that are sometimes surveilling or that are making a profit, or of communities that are creating digital production. I will move forward to this. Within some of the main things also within this project was a lot of the slow archive approach that Kim Kristen proposes, in which we discuss how the work was going to be done. We received mentoring from scholars that have been pushing for minimal computing practices, as well as post-colonial and decolonial practices, in order to create a project that could move forward to other initiatives in a sustainable way and an ethical way, working from both sides of the border, taking the interest from also the teammates of what they wanted to approach with this kind of work. Some of the projects that were gathered was throughout a very hard research that we made for several months, looking for archive projects that were promoted, and then also reaching out to people that would like to share projects. And it was a process of reaching out to each of the creators and asking them if they accepted to be part of this registry, if they can propose a description of the project, how they wanted to be presented, specifically of the different positionalities of these projects. And throughout this project and throughout this process, we encounter many projects that are inactive, that have disappeared because of the lack of funding, because of the change of technologies. And we follow a process in which we were also looking for projects that could really represent how this border has changed throughout time, historically, but also geographically, and thinking also about different technologies that are used, not only the ones that have been established in digital humanities, but other technologies that communities from the border have adopted to create this digital knowledge. At this point, the registry represents 115 projects, but we have a database with current projects that have been launched recently, and projects that are even in development that are part of this registry. I will end here so that my colleague Laura can continue with the last part, but feel free to visit the site and look for some of the projects that have different representations that are keep pushing for this single narrative of the border, but others that are contesting and resisting this narrative. And that's kind of the conversations we're looking for. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Sylvia, and thank you everybody for being here. So as you can tell from Sylvia's discussion, on the one hand, we're sharing a project, right? We're sharing a digital humanities project focused on borderlands, and we're sharing it starting with the Mexico-US border. But on a broader scale, as you can already tell from how carefully Sylvia outlined not just what we did, but why we did it, what we're trying to share through this project is a broader philosophy for borderlands digital humanities. And we envision borderlands digital humanities as a framework that can be used not just by our team, but by other teams who are looking to expand how we circulate knowledge to challenge that danger of a single story. So moving and continuing to move beyond just we're capturing this moment in time or this region, or we're capturing what's happening in this particular language or what happened, but to think about how we document migration patterns, how we document movement, how we document hybrid practices that are not just static. And that's part of what Borderlands Digital Humanities aims to do as a broader philosophy and movement. So we value collaborations, multidisciplinary approaches, and multilingual practices. And we argue that these, and we're not the only ones to argue this, of course, that these are key within the local DH project, as well as global digital humanities. So our goal is to continue moving beyond studying DH in particular regions or staying kind of within the limitations of one area or one context, but using this framework as we engage in other digital humanities projects through this approach of fluidity, of understanding that people migrate, people move, ideas migrate, ideas move. And so where we typically affiliate credit oftentimes erases the history or the work that allowed those projects to come into being. We can go to the next slide, Sylvia. So Borderlands Digital Humanities, and this has been an interesting part for me. So I'm originally from Santa Cruz, Bolivia. My grandpa actually grew up in Hatch, New Mexico, which is very close to the Mexico-US border. But I didn't know this part of my own history in my own family until I moved to the border to teach at the University of Texas at El Paso on the Mexico-US border, which was my first professor position. And this part of my identity is really critical to both like the affordances that I have participating in this project and also the limitations of my experience as someone who was not born there. And so within our team, what we try to really focus on is develop multiple points of intersection within the borderlands and really think about how our positionality and therefore the positionality of the projects we choose, the positionality of the creators who made those projects, influence everything that we do in digital humanities. So to do Borderlands Digital Humanities work, we argue that we have to ask questions like, who are we? How do we see ourselves? How are we viewed by others? What are the affordances and limitations of our lens? And how does this influence what we choose to archive, what we choose not to archive, what we choose to translate, what we choose not to translate? So thinking about this from an intersectional perspective that values the interactions of our privilege and our experiences with oppression. And this is very important to me as a white Latina from Latin America to think about my experience with the border is going to be very different from, the experiences of Haitian migrants who are currently at the border and navigating that space. And so as we continue documenting these projects, we have to contextualize them. And that is what the framework of Borderlands Digital Humanities allows us to do, like continue this dialogue and conversation to know that although we documented something in one moment in time, we have to consistently be mindful of how that context is changing. And we can go to the next slide. Through our work too, being Borderlands scholars, we also had to understand the role that language plays in Borderlands Digital Humanities. So in a lot of digital interfaces, we see language as segmented, right? There might be a Spanish side of a website, an English side of a website. And within United Fronteras, we have an English side and a Spanish side, but much of our content moves fluidly across those linguistic borders as well. Language is always changing. So the Spanish that my family speaks in Bolivia is different from the Spanish that my borderland family speaks. And so even within the team itself, we speak different types of Spanishes. We speak Spanish and English to, different competency levels for different contexts. And so part of what we're trying to document is how we engage in that linguistic negotiation. How do we bring our languages together and engage in collective translation and meaning making? How does that play a role, for example, when we reach out to the creators of these projects and ask them if they would like to be involved in the project? We may have to reach out to them in Spanish, we may have to reach out to them in English, and then the content that they provide us might be in one language or another, or a mixture of the two. And then we have to think really critically about how do we represent that on a website so that we're not privileging one language or the other, one side of the border or the other. And I think these questions are going to continue to get bigger as our project expands to our other borderland spaces, because we're going to have many other languages at play. We can go to the next slide, Sylvia. So one of the frameworks that we try to practice is we just kind of theme it participatory translation, which brings together this idea of participatory design, right? We're bringing in the creators of this project as part of our community, and we co-create this archive of digital representations of the border. how do we then incorporate translation into that so that we're representing all the different types of Spanishes that are spoken, the different types of Englishes that are spoken. And as we continue moving into other borderland regions and working with other people who speak other languages, how do we continue recognizing that fluidity of language in DH praxis? And I think that's something that Borderland Digital Humanities allows us to do. So that was a little bit about kind of the framing and the philosophy. And then I want to move on to say a little bit about, well, how have we worked toward this? Again, with no institutional support and no funding, but the community of a lot of different people. So we can go to the next slide. So we have several different outcomes that we've been able to put together so far, and we look forward to many more. So first of all, we hosted a symposium, a United Fronteras Digital Humanities Symposium in 2021. And I want to contextualize this like we did this during the pandemic. We brought people together from both sides of the border as women, predominantly women, not all women, you know, working as junior faculty or outside of institutions with very little support. But because we had taken care to build relationships with the creators who are represented in this database, they very graciously donated their time, their labor to coming together for the symposium so that we can be in dialogue, not just with other digital humanities academics or practitioners, but with these the creators of these projects, asking them what motivated them to create the project. How do they want the project to be represented and remembered in the cultural digital record, right? We're not the ones to make those decisions about how things get remembered. We wanted to have a collective conversation about that. We also know that many of us on the team are academics. And so publications are actually a pretty big part of the work we have to do. And so how do we do that ethically from this project? That has been a really key question. How do we take these ideas that were developed as a collective and publish on them, share them in academic venues without being extractive? So one example is a special issue on Borderlands Digital Humanities in Review in Digital Humanities on Borderlands DH that we were able to produce. And this I think is really interesting because it wasn't just academic articles that we wrote ourselves as part of the team, but it was us reviewing different digital humanities projects about the border. So in a sense, we get the publication credit, but in a sense, we also provide the review for other people and give that validity and credibility in academic spaces to the creators of these projects themselves. So I hope that it's clear that at each stage of this project, we're trying to embrace that Borderlands Digital Humanities philosophy. And our goal is to continue growing this and to continue collaborating with people like maybe you all, maybe your partners, so that we can, you know, expand the map of how the digital cultural record reflects not just one side or another side of the border, but that space in between, and what that space in between means for different people coming from different places with different positionalities. So with that very brief overview, we wanted to lead into maybe some discussion. We're happy to answer any questions, but two major takeaways is that United Fronteras is a project, but it's also a philosophy. So we told you our method, right? Like this is what we did, but we also told you our methodology. This is why we did this. This is why we approached it this way based on the scholarship we read, but also who we are. So maybe we can talk a little about how we continue making these frameworks apparent, because there are so many digital humanities projects out there that look amazing, are great, but it's oftentimes hard to tell what are the intentions behind that project, whose labor is reflected or not in that project, who gets credit for that project, and so on. At this point, we remain an independent project that's not tied to an institution, and it's very important for us to work across academic, industry, and community contexts. And while that has been great and has provided us with a lot of insights and a lot of valuable experiences, there's also some limitations, right, to what we can do, to how fast we can work. And so what are the benefits, the drawbacks, and the impacts of independent DH projects like this, especially those created by scholars from marginalized backgrounds who are already in kind of precarious positions in the academy? How do we continue taking this on? Do we continue taking this on? What does this look like? How do we push at an institutional level for the recognition of projects like this? So we propose these as just jumping off points for the discussion, but we are happy to answer any other questions as well.
At this time, I'd like to thank again Dr. Fernandez and Dr. Gonzalez for their wonderful presentation. I'm going to stop the recording and we will have our Q&A session.